It's been an interesting week of winter weather. Winter has finally arrived. So, as they say in Game of Thrones, winter is here. So, as Mark said, my name is Maggie Trundon. I'm the reading curriculum specialist at CESA 5. And so when he reached out and asked me to put something together for today, I did so and ran it by him, and so I hope you will find it beneficial and useful. He has given us time together today until noon. However, as he said, a big chunk of that time will allow for some team collaboration. And even with that, you might get out of here a little bit early to get back to your rooms prior to heading to lunch. So I don't want to take up too much of your time, especially like if you guys kind of develop a plan, because I know that this time of year you have plenty that you need to be doing as well. So you have access to this presentation. I believe he already shared it out with you via the agenda, so you are welcome to access it that way. I also have the URL up here, so you can feel free to access it as well. Because we're going to be learning about note-taking today, I'm also going to be asking you to do some note-taking where we're going to kind of practice the strategy that you may then use with students. So it seemed appropriate to do so. So just kind of heads up, that's why I put some paper at the middle of your table. So if you have something to write with, just make sure you have that out. And in just a little bit, I will explain what we are going to be doing for that. So, excellent. Can I get a just quick show of hands, and that way I can just kind of get a feel for who's in the room, and when we get to that collaboration time. Can you raise your hand if you are a middle school teacher? Can you raise your hand if you're a high school teacher? If you are both middle school and high school, okay, I'm getting a lot of the LA. If you teach math, okay, if you teach English, okay, if you teach social studies, if you teach science, if you teach art, music, SPI-Ed, technology, something else that falls into the specials encore elective category. Any special education teachers? Okay. Anyone I'm missing? Okay. And that just gives me a feel for who we have here. Obviously, the idea behind this is that hopefully there will be something that will be applicable to you with this content as we go through. So, to start, I'm just going to cover our learning goals for the time we have together. So participants will understand the importance of note-taking as an instructional strategy. I will spend a little time covering some of the research around note-taking briefly. Participants will understand the need for clear and common expectations, language, and structures surrounding note-taking to support and extend student learning. Participants will explore and adapt various note-taking templates for classroom and student use. So we'll go over some examples together. I've adapted some templates based on the self-reflection piece that Mark was looking for. And I found some examples of different note-taking templates for Cornell notes in various content areas, but you will then have an opportunity to kind of create, adapt your own, and come up with some ideas for how you may use it in your specific content area. So the time we have together will look something like this. So we're kind of going over the agenda now, and I'll share the norms. We're going to talk about note-taking as an instructional tool. We're going to talk about using self-reflection to deepen learning. I do have some Cornell Avid notes templates and examples for you, as I mentioned, and then, as he mentioned, that team collaboration, time, and application, because that's kind of the biggest part. So my norms for this time together: be prepared to listen and learn, be open to the experience and to each other, specifically when it comes to me asking you to try the note-taking strategies, and then just take care of your needs if you need to. You know where bathrooms are, you know where water is. If you need to do something, walk out, come back. We won't have a set break, especially when we get to that collaboration time. So if you walk out, just hopefully you'll come back. Okay, so now I'm going to explain the plan for our note-taking. Once we get a little further in, you'll notice that there are various templates for Cornell notes. I didn't make copies of this because I want to show you how you can do this with just regular paper, do it in a notebook, do it on lined paper. And so what I'm going to ask you to do is each grab a sheet of the just blank computer paper that you have at the center of your table. On the top of it, so we're going to set it up together. A little later in the presentation, I'm going to talk about the importance of teaching note-taking to your students, but just setting them up for success. And so all I've done is, if you can, on the top of your page, if you're looking at it the tall way, draw maybe like 1.5 inches down, one line straight across. And then you're going to, not down the middle, but maybe about 1/3 of the way in, you're going to draw a line from that line to about a couple inches up from the bottom. And then you're going to draw another long line across the bottom portion. So we kind of set up our main areas. So at the top, we're going to have a skinny column, a wider column, and then this bottom space. On the very top in the center, I wrote note-taking because that is the topic we are going to be learning about today. I have a spot for your name and a spot for the date. So if you can go ahead and complete those as well, and then you can fill in your name and the date. It is January 25th. Underneath your name, the note-taking and the date, if you could write essential questions. Actually, I don't know if this room has it, but if you are in a room that has a document camera that you can project, this would be something that I would project or show a picture of the students. But you're going to write underneath your name essential questions, and then leave a space for 1, 2 essential questions, which I'm going to give you in a moment. At the top of the skinny column, if you can write key ideas. At the top of the wider column, if you can write notes. And in the bottom long row, I'm going to have you write self-reflection. There are some versions where they ask you to summarize at the bottom. For our purposes, we're going to focus a little bit on that self-reflection piece. Okay, does anyone need anything repeated? Okay, so obviously, like I said, because you're adult learners, I would scaffold this a little differently if I was doing it with students, where I would show them this, I would have it up on the board for them. I would maybe use a piece of chart paper and have it up for them to see that if I was going to often have them do that. I may also provide them paper with lines because some kids require a little more structure, especially some of our special education students or students with dysgraphia that have a hard time just with that type of visual representation. So I'm going to go ahead and have you first fill in our essential questions on the top. So I asked you to leave a spot for 1, 2 essential questions. So these are the essential questions that we're going to explore during our time together this morning. 1, what are the benefits of note-taking? And 2, how can you support students with note-taking in the classroom? Once you have those 2 questions written in, you can set down your pencils so I know you have it. Okay, so at your tables, what I'd like you to do before I even get into any of the content, I would ask you to discuss, and you can do it as a full table, or if you have a bigger table, if you want to split off into a group of 2 or 3, but I want you to discuss with the people around you kind of what do we already know or think about note-taking as an instructional strategy. Maybe share how you're currently using it, how it's going with your students, or any struggles you have around getting your students to take notes. So just take a few minutes to kind of activate that background knowledge and talk with the people around you. Go ahead.
We don't get the background. If I'm writing it on the board, we don't want to be writing stuff.
of what was.
Yeah.
See, a lot of the kids, I know when it's.
Or if they tear it out and
After,
try to turn
but
it
you
into
want to mine, I let them take it, writing it down, just so they can see it. Whatever you write down, you
kind of like
can.
that.
I don't see that. It's asking you to have questions.
That like don't want to use it. They choose to use notebooks, but the kids that don't.
Some classes are
they
better.
send something. So like I make a digital notebook for them for the unit. They put it in the science folder or science. Even if they're like pretend they don't know it at all. I still should spend an excessive amount of time preparing for this. Okay, make sure it's in your science folder. Make sure you made a copy. Make sure that copy is in that notebook. That's where it is. So those kids that do have their own we double check it, we check to make sure it's and they're using it to
Give you about 30 more seconds to kind of wrap up your conversation.
Look it up, oh, that's it, isn't it?
Yeah, you just have been helping.
I realize that a lot of them starting in the corner.
I get a lot of I still have like, what do I rate? What part of that do I write down? What do I mean?
You got it,
No. There's a lot of times where like some kids, I can tell them that skill of like pulling out the important stuff and they'll double check with you. Is that what I was supposed to write? And I'm like, yeah, that's what I And then sometimes, and if I put something on the
All right, if you can wrap up what we're speaking, what you're saying.
Some of the ones that I.
Okay. Thank you. So that is just my way of asking you to kind of start thinking about how this might apply to you and what you're bringing to the table. And I did hear a lot of different, it is, especially with the digital age we live in, there's some things to be considered with technology. If kids want to just take pictures of things instead of notes, questions about how much we ask them to do, it'll look different in different places. And so just something to think about, and then we'll see if you're thinking shifts or if there's thoughts you bring to it when we get to that self-reflection piece towards the end. But as you listen to this presentation and participate in it today, what I'd like you to do, there will be information that I will have up here on the screen. Some of it is research, some of it is strategies, some of it talks about bringing in self-reflection. So what I'd like you to do is, as you are following along, keep the key ideas piece blank for now. What you will be doing is focusing on the notes column. So under the notes column, as things are presented to you that seem important or that I tell you may be important, I'm going to ask you to write some of those pieces down under your notes column. And then at the end, we're going to come back and reflect on that, come up with the key ideas and understandings and have that reflection piece. So to get started, note-taking matters. And so we're going to get into the research in just a second, but kind of the big idea around note-taking is that it takes learners from being passive learners to being active learners. So passive learning to active learning. By actively encoding information into words or pictures, the brain is forming new pathways, and it stores in our long-term memory. The typical student loses 90% of what is learned in class after 30 days. But writing down new learning helps save the information in multiple ways and makes it easier to access. Once it's stored, we can revisit information later to reinforce learning that happened the first time around and hopefully help them hold on to it a little longer. Think of the brain as a filing cabinet, and every time we learn something, it goes into a new file. But then we have to think about how to retrieve that information. So as you're looking at your notes, and I see some people writing down already, and this is where it gets kind of tricky, because we don't want our students to write down absolutely everything on screen, because they won't be able to keep up with us. And we'll talk a little bit about teaching note-taking. And even if you ask them to write down important pieces, they may not be able to tell you what's important, or they may not be able to figure that out on their own. And so how we handle that may depend on our class and our structure, or what we deem as important. Some people scaffold, which we'll talk about in a little bit. Maybe if I highlighted certain things I wanted them to write down, or underlined certain things I wanted students to write down, bolded things, and those are the things they really need to attend to. But I would for sure make a note about passive learning to active learning, and that process of actually writing things down stores things into our long-term memory. So something to think about. Okay. So the research. And on this presentation, if you're interested in looking at the actual website that it's linked to where some of this was pulled from, it was a research roundup that took a look at a variety of different resources and kind of consolidated it. So, first of all, note-taking matters. So, note-taking takes effort. Rather than passively taking in information, taking notes can form new pathways in your brain, which then, like I said, is stored in long-term memory and gives students opportunities to visit where it's been filed away. So ultimately, according to the research, it's better to take notes than not to take notes. The trick, though, is not having students write something down and then never look at it again. If we're going to ask them to write things down, we want to make sure we give them opportunities to revisit that information. Number 2, more is better. So, and this one's kind of interesting too as well for research, because although we tend to encourage students to keep their notes brief or short, studies show that the more students write down, actually, the better that they do. The more they take, the more they tend to remember later. So some students are faster at taking notes than others, but there are ways that you can help with that and provide scaffolding, which I'll get to in a little bit for number 6. So technically, more note-taking is better than less note-taking for getting students to remember things. Number 3, explicit teaching of note-taking strategies makes a difference. So if you're explicitly teaching students how to take notes, it improves the quality of their notes. Instead of just asking students to write things down, if you specifically model for them, show them examples of what that looks like, and give them time to practice in class, probably towards the beginning of the year, but even now, just to kind of stop and revisit depending on your students, or having them attend to certain things, and how do I decide what to write down, everything, just some of the keywords. So explicitly teaching some strategies for note-taking can make a difference for students, especially for students with learning disabilities, intellectual disabilities. And so the Cornell note-taking strategy is just one method to use to help you take down some of your notes, put down some key ideas. Other than key ideas, you could highlight vocabulary. You could highlight other important concepts. And then looking at either summarizing or self-reflection. But then asking students to then reflect on those, review those notes later. Number 4, adding visuals boosts the power of notes. Compared with writing alone, adding drawings to notes has a significant impact on memory and learning. And so there is a method of note-taking out there called sketchnoting that you may or may not be familiar with. And in the resources slide, I've actually put a link to YouTube to a video that combines Cornell notes with sketchnoting. And it's something that could actually be used to show students in a class to show them how they could use sketchnoting when note-taking, which I think is kind of cool. It would also be good just to share when teaching note-taking strategies. Sometimes simply including icons or adding color to your notes to help you remember or key in on things can be helpful. And adding visuals might fall naturally in certain content areas like art or science or math. But kids will surprise you, and there's ways that you could add that sketchnoting into other content areas as well, when you're talking about certain sports, etc. Number 5, revision, collaboration, and pausing boosts the power of notes. So when students are given an opportunity to revise their notes, to add to their notes, to pause and collaborate with peers around their notes. So let's say that I've had students that at this point have been writing down things in a classroom, but then asking them to pause mid-session and talk to the person next to them. What do you have? What do you have? What are you taking away? rewriting your notes can help you retain more information. And happening mid-process is beneficial. At least more beneficial than if you have them rewrite after the learning is done. But if students have a chance to collaborate, that can be powerful. So thinking about ways to plan breaks into your teaching for students to stop, discuss, add to their notes. That can have a maximum impact. So what I'm going to do here, partway through the research, is actually pause and try that. So what I'd like you to do, if you can look, like kind of partner with the person next to you, or if there's three of you, kind of a triad, and just at this point take a look at discussing and sharing what have you written down to this point, and not as a competition, like, oh, I've written more than you have, because again, there are some people that prefer writing things down and will write a lot. And you will find some people that maybe have written just a couple things with prompting. And I also know that because you're teachers, you're probably, well, I was going to say, you might be better inclined to take these notes than students may. However, I know that not all, teachers are the best students. Sometimes teachers can be the worst students. But what I'd like you to do is go ahead and look at the notes and compare with the person next to you. Share what you've written. And if you would like an opportunity to add something to your notes that your partner has on theirs that you also deem as important, you can do so now. So go ahead and take a couple minutes.
Oh, yeah. Right. What? Kind of the same thing. Alright, so I mean, look at her. I told her an acronym.
I took pictures running something additional.
I would look at that in a week and be like, I have no idea what I was trying here. Joe went up the hill. Maybe so I took 100 bucks off anytime. I'll paint you like one of your French ladies. I'd still stand by my statement.
You can wrap up your conversation in 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, and 1. Thank you. All right. I heard some good conversations. Midpoint here before I continue with 6, 7, 8. Anything anyone wants to share out for the good of the group? Questions, thoughts?
Amber wrote them, doodled them, and all that stuff. She
used sketchnoting.
She did, yeah. She was telling us it helps her a lot.
I'm very impressed with all of your note-taking efforts thus far. Thank you for sharing her notes. Okay, so continuing on. So let's take a look at number 6. So I mentioned this ahead, this idea that more is better, and as I've seen just by walking around the room, some of you have written more than others. And again, some of that's just natural. I know that when it comes to note-taking, I'm someone that likes to write down a ton of information. I also know that I'm someone that, depending on the situation, I like to type notes because I can type faster than I can write. And so we'll talk about digital note-taking in a second. But scaffolding. We want to be able to scaffold for students that may struggle with note-taking. Because I'm guessing all of you can think of a student that it's just like pulling hair or teeth to get them to write anything down in a classroom. And so some options for scaffolding to increase that retention. if there are ways to provide guided notes in the classroom, where you have, you know, this basic outline, but maybe you provide a shell for the students and they're filling in a little less information for those students. So maybe you have some of the notes and there's some blank spaces for them to fill in certain keywords. Or maybe you have some of the notes already, they need to add to them and they're gonna fill out, so what is the key idea? And they do that piece. Obviously the self-reflection and summarization piece we would want them to complete, but thinking about for those students who struggle with writing, some students with dysgraphia, is there a way for them to type their notes or to write minimally? And for those students that just need a little extra support or time, you know, how can we give them that shell? Maybe have some of these pieces here already pre-filled onto the note sheets, like I've set this up, and then I have blank spaces for them to fill in terms, fill in vocabulary, add a definition, but then they don't have to write down everything. So it's things to think about, like how I can make that a little easier for certain students. And then you could decide, does that go to everyone, or are there a handful of students that are gonna get that one? So things to consider. It can help with efficiency to plan your note outlines ahead of time, or to practice taking the notes ahead of time, so you know what you consider the key ideas that you want students to write down, and have it already pre-filled. So you take your own notes, and then as you're going through your class, that'll kind of trigger, oh yeah, I thought this was important to write down, so I'm gonna tell my students that's something you might want to remember and write down. Another simple form of scaffolding could be just to give verbal cues to students. So once they have their note sheets out in front of them, you know, say like, this is important, or I think you should write this down, and actually say it out loud for them so that they know that that is something that you deem important, and teach them to recognize those cues. So if I tell you something's important and you might want to remember this, they kind of hopefully perk up to like, oh, maybe I should write that down. And some of them you might have to physically go through and be like, you're going to write that down. Number 7, providing instructor notes, research shows, improves learning, but only if you provide the notes after they've already taken their own notes. So I could just give you a copy of my notes, however, because that's still passive learning and you're not putting in the effort, that kind of shows that I don't deem it as important. However, research shows that if you've taken notes and now I give you my notes in addition, that will kind of doubly benefit you, because then it will supplement what you've written with this other piece of information.
So if a student doesn't do the process of taking the notes, then as an instructor you don't share them with them, or otherwise how do you, you know, once you've done that once and the kid knows he's gonna get the instructor notes, what prevents them from not doing?
I know, and so that's something kind of going into there's ways around, or ways you can handle that. So like, for example, if you have your notes available to students who are absent, as only, you know, you've been absent, there are ways that you could go around it by maybe making their note effort graded. If there's a grade that you put in place, so depending on, you know, how you feel about that as a school or a system, but again, you'd probably want to be consistent, so if one person is grading them, others are grading them in a similar fashion. And you want to, like you said, if you're concerned that you're providing your notes to students means that they will stop taking notes, again, teaching them the importance of note taking and what the research says about why they need to do that. So maybe making sure, like, once you've taken your notes, and maybe, like you said, so let's say we take notes today, I'm not going to give them my notes at the very end of the class that day. It might be a few days later that I ask them to pull them out and revisit them, and then they get a copy of mine. And so at that point, if you had a student who had written minimally, at least they're, again, those students that you're pulling teeth, like, make sure that they have something down, and then they can have yours to supplement it, and then they interact with both of them. But yeah, I would definitely give them a score or some sort of an effort grade for doing their notes. And if you have a student who's absent, maybe they get an NA for that day where they don't get scored and they get your notes. But making sure kids know the importance of the passive versus active learning, teaching them that.
Thank you.
And even opportunity, like, so what I mentioned for number 5, that revision, collaboration, and pausing. So if you're actively stopping mid-lesson to give kids an opportunity to, okay, take a look at what you've written, discuss with a peer, hopefully when you add some of that collaboration time in, students will then, like, oh, I'm with a partner and we have to share. Maybe I didn't write anything down now, but my partner has some stuff, so I'll jot down a few ideas. So maybe adding some of those pausing pieces can also, and the collaboration pieces where they're physically working with their notes would help with that as well. But then, yeah, having opportunities for your notes to improve learning. But, I mean, again, I'd try and see how it goes. And if you find that the students then do stop, then maybe you don't give them your notes. Number 8, so last one, handwritten notes may be more powerful than digital notes, so research has found. However, digital note-taking can be fine-tuned. So this is kind of the tricky part with this, like the world we live in today, the way we're moving into this tech world. Are your students one-to-one on Chromebooks?
No. iPads.
iPads, okay. So iPads. So they have iPads for note-taking, etc. But so this idea that studies show that students who take notes by hand actually remember more, because again, when you come to thinking of the effort they put in, that active learning, they remember more than students who take digital notes. There is one study that shows that students who took digital notes got more information down, but those who wrote by hand did more with paraphrasing and captured more conceptual understandings. And so one of the things to consider if doing digital note-taking is how can we have opportunities for students to paraphrase or to put things into their own words. And part of that is where this self-reflection piece comes in. Let's see. When students handwrite notes and have an opportunity to review them, they do best. So like we've said, if you have an opportunity to come back to those notes. And so there's so much to know about technology. And obviously one of the concerns with technology is that it can be a distraction for students because there's other things when they're on a device that they tend to like want to lean toward as a distractor. So if you do allow digital note-taking, one of the things to do is consider how to keep them honest. You know, if I provide a basic outline that they can type into or fill out, you know, how can I make it so that that is still an active process? So that students just don't want to quick take like a screenshot and be done. Yes?
Do you have any thoughts on a student who, if I write stuff on the board and I suggest that they might want to write this down because it could be important, they want to take a picture of it? And do you have any thoughts or advice on that? No problem, I'll take a picture of it. Bam! And then I'm sure they never look at it.
I would probably...
So there's little input, you know,
Yeah.
little interaction on it.
Yeah, and I guess part of it would be like I would front load by explaining like these are my expectations for note taking. Like I understand that you have an iPad and you are welcome to take a picture. However, research shows that students actually process information and store it when they're physically, you know, working with it. So maybe just have something that they physically have to turn in that isn't a screenshot. And again, that's like the accountability check. So maybe something like that. But I know that, yeah, the digital world we live in.
Because it's like solution in their head, like, why would I write this down? Because I can take a picture of it.
Yeah. So, or again, you could just go the kind of, I don't know if it's archaic route, but like physically ask them to write things down and have something to show you for that. But, you know, again, it kind of has to be a system decision as well. So, like if one person allows students to take pictures of notes in their classroom, then that could be something, well, I'm allowed to take pictures of notes in this classroom. So it's kind of when we get to that collaboration time, it's where that team discussion and decision has to come in. And that's why I go through this research process, because again, and even going back to this idea that you want to make it active for students, the more we can help them to understand that. And you will have your kind of, you know, your students that really want to please, that will write things down. Your students that, you know, are like, oh, you know, I know I'm going to college, or I know I'm heading down this track, I'm going to work hard, I'm going to do this. You're going to have some other students that maybe aren't as motivated and don't see the benefit. So the more we can try to help them find that internal motivation for why this matters to them and how this can help them,
just ask a question of the group. How many of you grade student notes? Collect them and grade them? You do that weekly or?
Test night.
Testing.
Do you feel that you get quality stuff from most kids because you have a built-in expectation they're getting a grade, or are they all over the map?
I would say that I think you get more from kids because they know that there's something there that they're going to get points for as part of the grade. Does that mean everyone? No. There's still kids that struggle with even organizing their notebook and knowing where their note page is because they just flip to wherever in the notebook when they take, and so then they have to kind of find them to give them to me too.
And do you assign that grade kind of based on the ability level of the kid at all, or is the expectation the same for your high achiever as it might be for a special education student that might need additional support?
My expectation is that they're taking something. It's not necessarily they have to have everything I put on the board, but they should, because I'm a math teacher, they should have examples of types of problems. Doesn't mean that they have to have, if we went through 5 examples, they may not need that. A kid could get it from the first one, and that's okay as long as it's the same type of question. But they should have something for each day is what I look at. Did they have something, if we were talking about a new topic, was there something there that they're showing me that this is something new? If it's a second day on something, there may not be much for notes because it's that you're spending another day on a topic again.
Are you guys consistent? You're both math teachers. Do you have a consistent format that it's been developed through departmental conversation, or do you guys have your own structure?
Math is usually steps and examples.
So it takes care of
Basically
itself.
what it comes down to.
Takes care of itself.
Yeah.
So you may have already addressed this a little bit, but I didn't catch it. With your lower kids, do you find that it's another chance for them to get a low score, whereas your high kids, it's another chance for them to get a high score? Or do you find that your low kids might actually be helping their grade a little bit by taking the notes, showing at least attempts and participation and things like that?
I think that, I don't think it should be something that it's like high score, low score. Even if you provide scaffolding for some of those special education students, I would consider that a modification that shouldn't impact their score. So if they're doing that note, and depending on how you set up like your assessment system, I wouldn't say, well, she wrote more than she did, so you get, A, you get a C, so it's really more of a, you have to kind of decide how you assess that. But I think the goal is, I see the effort, I see that you're working to get this information down, and that I wouldn't want it to impact in that way. If those students are actively attempting to take down information, but they maybe have a physical or mental barrier that's getting in the way, we provide the scaffold to help them, but that shouldn't impact their score.
Well, and what I see with my middle schoolers in health classes, some of them that are not good test takers and don't score well on the end assessment because they're with me and doing the notes in that scaffolding process, that note grade for them kind of helps that lower assessment score in the end, because for a lot of them I could verbally ask them the question or reword it a different way or kind of lead them and they'd be able to answer it, but you put a piece of paper and a test in front of them and they're not good test takers. So where that scaffolding of the notes helps some of those kids that typically would have a lower assessment grade.
But is the purpose of the note taking so they do perform better on those tests? Is somehow the effectiveness of the note taking not transferring over to one of the intents of the note taking? If they're taking notes and they're getting a score on notes, but it doesn't translate into improvement in their other assessments, isn't some of that improvement what the purpose of
I would
taking
argue though
the notes?
that pencil paper assessment sometimes for some kids is just, it changes their whole mental emotional state,
And so there's other barriers that are prohibiting them from performing on that, and it's not that they don't know the content. It's that the noise in the room, or it's what they had for breakfast this morning, or that argument before they left the house, or something like that, where,
Well, and those kids with testing anxiety, I would also look at, in addition to that paper pencil option, are there alternative ways
Right.
that they can share
more
what they
time.
know with
Yeah,
you?
Exactly.
Yeah, so that they aren't just like, oh, I can't take this test well, and that's gonna impact my final grade. One of the other things to consider too, for note-taking, is there a way, and it depends on the assessment and kind of the purpose, because obviously, are we testing skill or are we testing content? That'll kind of weigh into it, but you know, there are some assessments where maybe students can access their notes, and if they have access to those notes on the assessment. And so again, that's kind of the, you know,
So Mark, can use their notes on their
Wait.
final too, so that's part of the incentive in class to do notes is you get to use this on your final in the end. If you have the steps for everything, an example of how to do everything, there's no reason you shouldn't do
I also allow notes for tests. I was just kind of curious as to, is it an all or nothing? I mean, are you as a teacher, are you just kind of browsing? Yeah, you got some stuff in there. It looks like it makes sense. You're going to get 5 points. No, you didn't turn anything in. You're going to get 0 points. Because if it becomes a lot more than that, I would assume there's going to be some challenges in trying to find the time to go through 75 notebooks, or however many you might have. So I'm just kind of curious as to how deep some of you went into it.
So when they take the test, I collect the notebooks and I do it while they take their test. And
Okay.
yeah, that's basically what it is. I just count the number of days. It's like if there's 8 days of notes, if they have 8 days worth of notes, they get 30 points. If they don't, they get less.
I have two comments. One, you were talking about notes not lining with like their testing ability. And I agree that it might be the wrong kind of test for that child, but I also think right now the way that kids are doing notes in history is still very passive, even though we're requiring them to write it. And I like some of these strategies for making it more active. And I think that might be one reason why we're not seeing a perfect correlation. But also then when it comes to grading the notes, I created a 4-point rubric that this is when I started grading notes, because I used to do it the way Shannon does it, like by days, and just count the days, and they got like 5 points a day or something like that. But then when we switched to unit plans, we made a rubric out of 4 points, and I defined what a 1 means, what a 2 means, what a 3 means, what a 4 means, and then also what a 0 means. So
Does legibility fall in there at all?
no, it doesn't, unfortunately. So that's helped me grade fast because I know those definitions of a number so well that even just at a glance, I can say this is a 3.
Thank you.
anything else? I'm glad we're having these discussions, because it is important to, you know, even leading up to the collaboration time, thinking about that and how can we align some of our systems or steal ideas that are working in other places. All things to consider. So how can note-taking, obviously there's various ways note-taking can be used to support learning. So if you are doing classroom lecture and you want students to take notes, you know, that is kind of the main thing we think of. But with technology, you can do a lot with flipped learning, where you pre-record the teaching for the day. Students watch it at their own pace, and then they can stop, pause, take notes as they go through. There are even some technology apps where you can take a presentation that it will play, and at certain points it will pause and ask students to respond to questions before they can even move on. But so options for flipped learning, watching videos, that's something too if a student's absent, where they have access to the lecture or the content still that they can digitally watch and still be held accountable for that learning, even if they missed what was happening in class that day. Reading accountability, so for reading a novel, to reading an article, to reading any other textbook information, you know, asking students to write down key takeaways, theme, vocabulary, understandings. So that can be something that it can be used for. When doing research, it becomes pretty important. So teaching how to find information, put it in your own words, paraphrase, so that we're teaching them, you know, how not to plagiarize, and the what can happen, the dangers of plagiarism, what happens at a higher level if you try plagiarizing. Even field trips, if you go on field trips, having the opportunity for students to bring a clipboard or a notebook and write down some of my key takeaways from this learning experience and having them have an opportunity to reflect on it when they return. So obviously there's ways that you can use note-taking, and I'm sure we're using it in various ways now, but again, thinking about how can I do this in different ways in the classroom. And there's ways to think about how, like, if I have my content, how can I adapt note-taking or incorporate note-taking in ways that will, really activate the learning of the student. Okay, so I've talked a little bit about that importance of teaching note-taking, and so just like all the other things, we really just can't assume that students know what it means to take notes, especially when we're talking about our middle school students that are coming in. Because again, it's that idea that it's like, oh, write down the important information. It's like, oh my gosh, what's important information? And so I think, starting at a younger age and explicitly teaching it, but then every year, starting the year out and even mid-year, revisiting, how to take notes. Have a class lesson on how to take notes. And if it's something different that you expect in your content area, making sure that you explicitly teach them and tell them, this is how I expect you to take notes in science. Just like reading and writing is different in science and social studies and math, maybe my note-taking is going to be a little bit different. But explicitly teaching them what that looks like by having a lesson where you physically model like note-taking. Like, this is what I'm going to write down, this is how I'm going to set up my paper, this is how I'm going to know. Teaching students common word abbreviations. And it could be also, specific or unique to your content area. Like, these are some abbreviations that are going to come up in here for specific words. You could have a chart on the wall for them to reference. Because when I think about all of the different ways I abbreviate words, at some point along the line, some of those were taught to me, some of them I picked up, but we can't assume that kids will just automatically know to do that. Teaching the benefits of note-taking, like I said, that even just letting them know like what the research shows about what's happening in their brain and like how them actively doing this work will help them to, be able to store that memory and retrieve that and find that later. But modeling it, do you have document cameras in your classrooms? So maybe something, a plea or a request, but also with the iPads, if you have your own iPads, the ability to just project and model under that way and have it Chromecasted, that's an option as well. So, but again, just being explicit. Don't assume students know these things. Revisit it throughout the year if you see that they're slipping or if you see that they struggle with it. The more we can explicitly teach them everything. Routines, behaviors, what it looks like, an example of what, good notes look like at the end of a lecture. Maybe the first time you're teaching, you have, this is the content, ooh, I'm gonna stop and I'm gonna write this down, you write this down, and so you're doing it together. So think about how you can build that piece in. Okay. So we talked about, and this is too, like with different content areas and different expectations, one of the things to consider is this idea that as students move, especially middle school, high school, from class to class throughout the day, you want to think about the benefits of having common expectations for students, of having common structures and language that you use with students. Obviously, the content is going to be different, but if you all adopt one note-taking strategy as a high school or middle school, or if all math teachers do something the same way, just think about too for kids, one more thing we're asking them to keep in mind is like, oh, I have to do this for math, but I have to do this for science, I have to do this for bio, I have to do this for English. So if there's a way to be consistent across content areas, so if I go from my math teacher to my history teacher, and I know it'll be kind of similar in what's expected, I think that's helpful and beneficial for students to collaborate across teams and having common expectations for grading. So for those of you who are grading notes versus those of you who aren't, if there are ways to collaborate, to have people kind of on the same page, so students know what that looks like across the board. And it's okay if not everyone's doing the same thing, because again, it might look different for your content area, but again, then being very upfront with students about this is what it looks like in this classroom, this is the expectation, this is why this is important, and this is how it's gonna be scored, so they know. And then, yeah, that same collaboration when developing note-taking frames, using common structures and language so students become more comfortable. And so if there's a way to use a similar structure, you know, across the board, so students are like, okay, I'm always setting up my paper this way. Or I'm always gonna have a self-reflection piece on the bottom, or whatever it may be, but looking for some ways that you can provide consistency for students. It may not always work that way, and students do need to know that by the time if they go off to college, their professors will all have different expectations too, and to some extent, you do have to learn to be flexible and that, you know what, I may not like it, but sometimes I just have to do what this person expects of me, because that's kind of what the real world asks for, but how can we slowly, like, you know, start with some consistency and common expectations, and then veer off a little bit from the norm. And maybe it starts with, you know, 6th grade, we're all doing the same thing, so that we can just get them to take notes and understand what it looks like, because they're just getting used to the all of a sudden going from a different person all day. To maybe by 9th grade, okay, now you have this down, and now you're doing this a little differently, this a little differently, but again, it depends on your system, your structures, you know, your preferences, and you coming to agreement on that. Okay. Before I get into self-reflection learning, no, I don't think anyone's, you know, done the like stand up, stretch, take a break thing. Do you guys want me to give you a 5-minute break? Because I know that this is a lot of sitting. Why don't you guys, we'll take 5 minutes, reconvene at 10:35. I have a bag of candy here. I will pass it around if you want to put a pile on your table or just grab a few pieces, but that is why this is sitting here, so help yourself.
You're gonna say me either. Why don't you put it in construction session, go walk the house and wait and see.
I drink candy every day.
Never get into a sarcastic fighting match
It's
with
still
Mark
going.
Rubinstein.
I'm not saying
He shows his darker side.
Who's that?
You. Yeah. Never, no, don't get into a sarcastic fight with Rubinstein, because his darker side, his previous life will come forward.
He's always picking on me, I don't know that.
The 80s, about 1989, Mark Rubinstein comes out.
Yeah. Hey, one of my hairstyle. Your what?
89 version.
My hairstyle. 89.
Fighting myself not to take any of that. So.
Okay, I'll put it on this side of the table.
Yeah, don't put it on.
I'll still pass the bag.
See, I end up having to look because like I have to pull certain ones because of allergies.
Oh, okay.
So I'm curious what's in here.